It's the last night of January 1953. Britain is under attack.
You can't imagine what it was like, I'll be honest with you.
From the Shetlands to the Thames estuary, few are spared the impact of an enormous storm bearing down on Britain.
You could hear it roaring. You couldn't believe it, the height of the waves.
This vast storm is the engine behind a national disaster. It will sink ships.
The women and children were put onto a lifeboat and horrendously it got smashed against the side of the ship.
Send hurricane-strength winds across the country.
The wind was so strong, it was horrendous.
And trigger a tidal surge that will claim hundreds of lives.
You could hear people screaming, crying for help.
And as we jumped up, we were floating on the mattress.
It just threw me across the room. And I thought, right, that's it, we've got to get out now.
24 hours of shocking tragedy will stun the nation.
After all that the country had gone through in the war, we were just starting to recover again when nature hit us with this big whack. And there was nothing we could do, really, against that force of nature.
In the early 1950s, life in many parts of Britain is like a glimpse of a bygone era.
Everybody would help one another. The milkman used to put the milk on, and the money used to be lying on the doorstep ready for them. Nobody locked the doors. Our house never been locked as far as I can remember.
In places like coastal North Norfolk, rural life continues, despite the recent trauma of World War II.
We were very lucky. Father had the field where the donkeys were and a couple of cows down there. So we did live well, really.
June Searle's family runs pony rides on the beach in Hunstanton.
We had to be up early in the morning, or I did, at 7 in the morning, to go down to saddle the donkeys and ponies.
Beach holidays here are part of the fabric of post-war British life, especially for Pete Waterman, living in bomb-scarred Coventry.
We were all from the town, so the chances of you riding a horse in Coventry were about 6 billion to 1. But when you got to the seaside, all of the seasides had donkeys you could take a ride on. I remember Hunstanton as this idyllic English seaside place. That's why you went there, because it really was the classic seaside place.
But for many, life is hard in the aftermath of the war.
Britain had not been long out of the Second World War. A lot of people had lost housing. A lot of Britain was still in a kind of period of austerity.
It was a bit hard because I think we only allowed 8 ounces of sweets per family per week. A lot of people, think that life must have been pretty grey and dull. But as children, we never knew that because we weren't used to anything else.
In January 1953, Barry Barton and his family are on the waiting list for council houses. While they wait, they live in a converted Nissen hut in a former prisoner of war camp by the sea in East Essex.
When you walked into it, it was just like a normal little bungalow.
They might be simple dwellings, but house-proud families make the best of the situation.
The 2 main bedrooms were on the end, and I was in the left-hand side one, and my mother slept in the other side with my sister at the time. I knew quite a few people. There was a few kids, my friends, we used to have a right old game over there, It was good life, wasn't too bad.
While life could be hard for some, there are glimmers of hope on the horizon.
It was still a time of looking forward to a new time with things like the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. But before we could get to this, sunlit uplands of positivity that the 50s generally did bring, unfortunately, the country had to go through this really quite terrible ordeal that lots of people had to suffer.
In this programme, we'll follow how the Great Storm of '53 unfolded hour by hour. Off the north coast of Scotland, a powerful storm pushes south from Iceland.
So this was a huge storm, extended towards Scandinavia, towards Germany, across the UK. It was absolutely mammoth. It was a killer. It was going to impact a huge area.
In 1953, forecasters do not have the technology to know exactly how bad the situation will get.
Back in 1953, there were some extremely good bench forecasters, as we used to call them, in the Met Office. Obviously, covering the land was pretty good. You had lots of observations every hour, every 3 hours, every 6 hours, but a bit more sparse out at sea. Really, you were on thin ice when it came to looking to see what storms were developing out in that part of the world, between Iceland and Scotland.
This is a storm that will touch thousands of lives and lead to death on a scale that hasn't been seen since wartime.
It was in the weather forecast, however, this would prove to be much, much worse than anyone had been expecting.
In southwestern Scotland, the car ferry Princess Victoria prepares for its morning journey. A 2-hour crossing from the port of Stranraer to Larne in Northern Ireland. Today, only around 130 foot passengers and 50 crew are on board.
She was a modern ferry, she was a roll-on, roll-off vessel, but because of the intensity of the waves in the East Pier, they decided it wasn't safe to actually load cars onto the vessels.
Among the passengers is 19-year-old Winnie McDowell from Stranraer, travelling with her fiancé to Northern Ireland.
I think she was my granny's favourite. She said that, you know, everybody loved Winnie and she was just really popular. They met down at the harbour and got on together. And my mum said that it was so stormy that morning, my granny pleaded with her not to go, but she didn't listen.
Captain James Ferguson studies the weather forecast. His grandson, also called James, still lives and works in Stranraer.
As often is the case in winter time in this area, we usually get strong westerly winds, and you know, there'd be a wee bit of trepidation as the crew were getting the ship prepared to go, but I don't think there was anything unusual. The Met Office forecast was showing that the storm was to subside, and there was always an expectation that the ship sailed, and a bit like the Titanic, I think most people felt it was unsinkable.
Captain James Ferguson is a popular figure in the Stranraer community.
He was an experienced captain, and also I think what's very significant is that Captain Ferguson and many of those who were on board, including the women, had actually served in 2 world wars.
He was well respected as an individual, and like many of his crew lived along the shorefront, they all lived in close proximity to each other and knew each other. And it was a close-knit community, so everybody did know each other in those days.
The Princess Victoria leaves port and motors across the sheltered waters of Loch Ryan. In 30 minutes, it will cross into the North Channel of the Irish Sea on its journey to Northern Ireland. But as it heads for the open sea, the storm strengthens.
The winds would have been picking up some strength already. It's getting stronger and stronger and stronger.
That ferry service would have been used to pretty choppy conditions, to say the very least, in that North Channel. So maybe, because they do it on a regular basis, they thought it wasn't going to be too bad in the time that it took, because it's not a long way.
In 1953, Davy Brown is a young postman in Stranraer. As the ferry heads for the Channel, he is dropping mail off on the headland with a clear view of the Irish Sea. What he witnesses disturbs him.
That particular morning, I was a postman. I did round the peninsula, round the corner. The lock was bad enough, but once you get round the corner, which is 2 miles from Cairnryan, it's ferocious. And there was foam coming off the top of the crest of the waves. And it was like a giant snowball. To my mind, you couldn't see a thing. But it was just a mist, you know. This froth, it was travelling tremendous through the air. But the sea itself, oh, unreal.
"400 miles to the south in Hunstanton, Norfolk, winds are just starting to pick up. Today is different for June Searle and her family. There'll be no tending to the ponies and donkeys on a day like this.
Father, I could see the worried look on his face. He was really worried on Saturday when the winds got up. They were about 80 to 100 mile gale force, so you can imagine. I mean, Mother wouldn't let us go out because everything was flying everywhere.
In neighbouring Snettisham, young Dave Bocking is tending the animals on his father's pig farm. Dave's father, an experienced farmer, has a hunch that something bad is on the way.
My father said to me, the winds are bad, hope we don't lose a straw stack. The winds were very bad and they was getting worse and worse as the day went on. And we didn't expect a flood, definitely didn't expect a flood.
On the southwestern coast of Scotland, the Princess Victoria ferry approaches the mouth of Loch Ryan to begin its journey across the Irish Sea.
The ship would have set off and yeah, it would be challenging conditions. The loch's pretty sheltered, but there was full confidence that the vessel was going to continue on its journey.
The moment the ship leaves the shelter of the loch, the crew is shocked by the intensity of the storm.
And at that point, they realised the full fury of what was actually going on out there, and that what had been forecast was not actually the conditions that they were sailing under.
Captain Ferguson decides to abandon the trip and head to safety.
They were going to try and turn the ship and come back into the loch. And unfortunately, in the Victoria's situation, when the ship was turned, the back door, it burst open. Despite trying desperately to get that door closed again, it just proved impossible. One side of it had actually buckled, so there was actually no physical way that they could make that ship watertight again.
Unable to expose the damaged rear doors to the pounding waves and wind coming from the west, the ship cannot return to port. They have no choice but to continue on their journey to Ireland, into the teeth of the storm.
At about 9:45, they sent a Morse code message to say, "Boat is in trouble, please come to help." Unfortunately, it got worse after that.
As the ship limps towards its destination in the worsening storm, it's becoming clear that the situation could end in tragedy.
For passengers, it must have been terrifying on the day, because by that stage, they knew that the ship was in trouble. The captain had already put over the tannoy that, to get the life jackets, etc. on. That must have been an absolutely horrendous time for everybody on board that ship.
It is only 10 in the morning, but the storm punishing the Princess Victoria is just getting started on its path of destruction across the country.
It's actually only the first awful event of what became a disastrous day for Britain.
Late January 1953, a huge storm is bearing down on the north of Britain, lashing Scotland with growing wind speeds and increasingly large waves.
As this cyclone really tracked around the coastline of Scotland, it deepened incredibly quickly, from 987 millibars to 963, and they saw winds in excess of 100 miles an hour.
Caught in the middle of the Irish Sea on its journey from Scotland to Northern Ireland is the ferry Princess Victoria.
It's almost unimaginable, the nightmare of waves which are 30 to 40 feet, the violence of the storm, the crashing of the waves, and then the fear that will this one be the one that tips over.
On the Princess Victoria, what should have been a straightforward 2-hour journey is becoming a nightmare. The ferry sends SOS messages as it struggles towards Northern Ireland. It is taking on water and beginning to list to one side.
Although the list had started about 10 degrees, it quickly, they reckoned it maybe about 40 degrees by this stage. 40 degrees, you would basically say over 45 degrees and your ship would roll over. It was a very precarious situation.
At 1:30, the Princess Victoria is in sight of the Irish coast, having crossed over 40 miles of brutal open water. But then, the engines stop. Linda Thompson's father, Charlie, is a steward on the stricken ship.
One of the passengers had asked him to go and fetch his coat. So he went down and he says the water was up to his ankles. And then another passenger asked for his luggage. He went back down and it was up to his knees.
With the vessel tipping almost to a right angle and with no power, the decision is made to abandon ship.
And they did try to save women and children first. They were on the first lifeboats.
The women and children in this lifeboat thought they were safe. They were first to be rescued, as it were, or so they thought.
But tragically, what happened is that the boat crashed against the hull of the ship.
In an instant, all of the women and children in the lifeboat are lost to the waves.
And that's one of the awful tragedies of the Victoria. People were praying, people were singing hymns, crockery flying everywhere. I suppose, they knew at that stage that it was inevitable, that they were going to die, they were going to drown.
Finally, the ship slips under the huge waves.
And my dad was one of the survivors. And he said that he saw Captain Ferguson on the bridge saluting as the boat went down.
These guys basically went down with the ship, just like the Titanic. So few officers survived. But that's just the way it was. It was a sense of duty.
Lifeboats and survivors float in the waves for hours until they are finally discovered by an air and sea search operation.
When we got out there, the ship was gone. And the weather was very bad. Conditions were very bad. Visibility was bad. B was heavy.
I clung onto this raft. I was about 2 hours in the water, and it was just myself and another person on the raft about 30 yards away.
Like many on the ship, this sailor's chin bears a wound from the life jackets supplied to passengers as they jumped into the sea.
The life jackets were made of cork. It actually contributed to their death in a lot of cases. As people jumped into the water because of the cork, it actually broke their necks.
Our story begins with the return of the Donaghadee lifeboat from the scene of the tragedy at sea. Only 44 out of 172 passengers and crew survived.
It reminds me to a certain extent of Titanic, but just that horrendous situation of being, at sea and waiting to be saved.
Evelyn Anderson's 19-year-old aunt, Winnie, and her fiancé are among the missing.
Somebody told me years ago that they were last seen in the water together, but I don't know if that's true or whether it's one of these romantic notions to make us feel better. I don't know.
Many days pass until Winnie's body washes up in Northern Ireland.
I think Winnie's body was one of the last ones that was actually recovered. She was going to meet her future in-laws, and unfortunately it didn't happen. It's really quite sad, isn't it? Because she didn't really have a life.
The sinking of the Princess Victoria during the Great Storm of 1953 still stands as the greatest loss of life in British waters since World War II.
133 people on the boat died that day, and it's a truly, truly shocking number.
It was a terrible, terrible event, and it was a kind of foretaste of what was to come.
Within weeks of the disaster, an official inquiry is held into why the Princess Victoria was lost.
The inquiry clearly pointed out that there were structural errors with the ship. The stern doors, they were totally inadequate, and any ship that's not watertight really is not a ship that should have been built. When you analyse it, it wasn't fit for purpose.
The sinking of the Princess Victoria has similarities with another ferry disaster from 1987.
By first light today, this 8,000-ton ship looked like a toy, yet she was by now already a grave. Almost flat underneath, whatever happened to her last night, once destabilised, few were surprised she capsized so fast.
There are actually quite eerie parallels between what happened with the Princess Victoria in 1953 and then 30 or so years later with the Townsend Torreson Zeebrugge disaster with a Herald Free Enterprise ship that sank just outside of Belgium, port in Belgium.
In the aftermath of the Zeebrugge disaster, questions are asked about how a seemingly safe ship could capsize so quickly.
We found the ship 1,300 yards from the harbour walls. Prominent, the gaping, now doorless entrance in her bows, known to have played a critical role in her downfall.
And what happened in 1987, a situation where a roll-on, roll-off ferry had a problem with its doors, similar kind of issue with a faulty boat. And one wonders if perhaps lessons should have been learnt from the Princess Victoria.
The eye of the massive storm that caused the disaster in the Irish Sea now moves east into the North Sea. Within hours, tragedy will affect the entire length of Britain.
So after the Princess Victoria, the storm gathers pace and goes round the top of the British Isles and down the east coast of Scotland.
As the eye of the storm hits the North Sea, it strengthens and changes direction.
Well, the storm was now accelerating southwards down to the bottom end of the North Sea, giving a bit of a side swipe to places like Hull, which was just let off fairly lightly in comparison to what was going to happen further down towards the Wash and Norfolk. Norfolk sticks out into the North Sea, so it's inevitable, really, that they're going to get the first real battering from that very fiercely intense storm as it came ever closer.
As the eye of the storm heads south, pressure continues to fall. A new and dangerous phenomenon develops: tidal surge.
The low pressure is deepening, so there's less pressure being pushed on the water at sea level, so the sea level is able to rise. This was the time of the full moon, of spring tides, which adds even more to the surface of the water anyway, 2 or 3 meters. So almost like a perfect storm, all the things just enhancing the level of the water higher and higher and higher. So you had these winds which were incredibly powerful, pulling the currents and the water, the sheer volume of the water, down the North Sea towards these low-lying areas.
Norfolk in the 1950s was still a very rural place. It was a very close-knit community kind of place. People would have lived in their village and known everybody else in their village or their community.
It is tea time in the small coastal towns of North Norfolk, like Hunstanton and Snettisham. Many live in bungalows and caravans built on the edge of the county's shallow, sloping beaches.
Now, at that point on a Saturday, families would have been mostly at home. Some of them would have been lucky enough to have had a television. Otherwise, it might have been actually tea time, cup of tea, and something to eat.
June Searle's father is the de facto local weather forecaster and knows the tides. Before the storm hits, he has a hunch that there are going to be floods.
So he did go down in his car to warn people in the bungalows they must get out because there's going to be a big tidal surge.
But one man can only do so much, and most are unaware of what is coming. Early evening, the surge arrives in Norfolk.
The water has to go somewhere, and it has to go onto the land because it can't go anywhere else. It's the path of least resistance, really, in a way.
The sea just rushed in, devouring up towns and villages and farms. People said it was like a war zone.
We didn't have a sea wall, so it came straight through, rushing through.
The last night of January 1953, a huge storm brings a wall of cold seawater onto the coastline of North Norfolk. In its path are low-lying coastal towns like Hunstanton and Snettisham.
In North Norfolk and around the coast, people were very much living in relationship to the sea. So they were used to floods, actually, but not on this scale.
I think it was about 5:30, the sea hit the town.
Frank Fleming's father, a local firefighter, comes to the aid of houses in the South Beach area of town. Frank is with them in their fire engine.
When we got halfway down that road, I could see something dark. I couldn't understand what it was, and then I realised it was a tidal wave. And then the water started coming up, came in the doors, came in the bottom of the windows, and at that stage I was lifted out through the windows and placed on the roof, and there was about 8 feet of water in that roadway. So anybody in there without proper suits or help didn't stand a chance. It was awful.
Frank Fleming and June Searle lose several classmates in the stricken houses on the seafront.
And I had friends down there, well, they were at school with me, the Patworths, and they all died, didn't they? Except one. She wasn't there for the night.
I didn't stand a chance. I was 12, and I really shouldn't have been on the fire engine. But they thought it was just going to be a practice pump out, and I'd enjoyed the trip. So it turned from being a little jolly to a frightening experience. But very, very difficult to face up to the fact that all my mates, or several of them, had died in this road.
In Snettisham, a few miles further along the coast, 18-year-old Dave Bocking has heard about flooding in nearby King's Lynn.
I went home and told Mum and Dad the water had come over in King's Lynn, and Dad said, we better go down and see if animals are okay. And we tried to bicycle down to the beach. The winds were so strong, and we walked into water. Then you get to know that things weren't how they should be.
Struggling through the water, they head down towards their pig farm near the beach.
You couldn't see much because it was dark. And we only had torches. When we got there, with those all gone virtually.
In the howling winds and rushing water, a scene of devastation is revealed by flashlight.
There was Mr. Footer and Miss O'Brien. They tried to drive out, and they just got washed straight out of the back doors of their van. And the other couple who lived the other side of the roadway, they both got drowned. And then another lady got drowned just past them. She was hanging in the bushes everything just seems to stop, if you know what I mean. It's funny to explain, but life's just like a switch. You switch from one thing to another. Yeah, it was a horrendous night, a horrendous night.
A community rescue operation begins that saves many lives. The conditions are deadly. 10 hours before, the storm was sinking a ship in the Irish Sea, and now it's hurling a wall of water at the coast of Norfolk. The storm of 1953 is turning into a national disaster.
So that evening, the seawater was on the land. We're talking above the height of most people. The numbers speak volumes, 160,000 acres of flooded land across eastern England.
Alongside the flooding, the storm is still bringing winds of over 75 miles per hour and cold temperatures. Along South Beach Road in Hunstanton, not everyone is local.
Norfolk people were really used to Americans being in their county because, of course, there'd been lots of American bases there, and all around East Anglia, actually, in the Second World War.
Most Americans in the area are from a US Air Force bomber wing stationed at RAF Sculthorpe near Hunstanton.
Hunstanton was noted for many years being called Little America for the amount of Americans that did live in Hunstanton.
As news of the disaster spreads, American airmen like Rice Lemming rush to help in the rescue efforts.
The 67th Air Rescue Squadron had specialist equipment like dinghies and amphibious vehicles, which was going to be needed very much in the flood relief and rescue efforts. So the 67th then went off, mobilised and went off to Hunstanton. One of the airmen involved was Airman Rice Lemming.
June Searle, concerned about her classmates and her family's many animals, bumps into Rice at the water's edge.
The American had just arrived and he had got his immersion suit on.
Lives are reported to have been saved by this young American airman, Reese Lemming. His height of 6'2" and his rubber exposure suit were of great help.
And he'd got this boat behind him, which I believe was the boat from under the B-29 bombers that they used to fly. And I'll never forget him saying, he looked down South Beach Road and he said, "Is that a river down there?" So they said, "No, that's the road." So off he went, and I saw him walk off into the dark, dragging this boat.
Lemming heads off into the floodwaters in search of survivors.
You can't imagine how dark and cold that must have been. You can hear screams of people in the night asking for help, and all he's got is a very, very basic flashlight and a dinghy, and he's wading out into this icy cold water to rescue people from their rooftops.
It was January in the North Sea and the water was extremely cold. I came to the first house and I could hear some children screaming. I remember one time I had so many people in the raft that I was really concerned about whether I could even get them back. 25 years, you ought to get over this.
He carried on, carrying out until eventually hypothermia and exhaustion kicked in, and he literally couldn't do any more than what he had done on that night. His relief rescue efforts had saved 27 people.
Oh, that must have been horrendous for that man. Oh, it really must.
He risked his own life and was eventually taken to hospital suffering from exhaustion.
Lemming becomes a local hero and receives a George Medal for gallantry later that year.
He was an incredible hero. They all were. Anyone involved in that night in the relief efforts or individual efforts all around the country are heroes, and what heroes should be.
Now he receives the Distinguished Award for his gallant help in time of trouble.
As the American military rescue operation in Hunstanton gets going, the community in Snettisham is working with the British military to save people from the floods. Dave Bocking will help in the rescue effort until 4 in the morning.
We done what we could, and you couldn't do no more because the weather, the water was so strong. And our torches was all running out. It was just water, 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 wherever you looked. And then bodies were starting to be brought out, and that was not very good.
As the magnitude of the disaster hits home, June's family discover that they have lost all of their animals in the flood, apart from one.
We only had one horse survive. She was 17 hands, a piebald mare. She's a strong lady, but she was cut all over with barbed wire and everything. But there, she survived. She was the lucky one.
On the beach where it all happened, the past is still very much alive for Dave Bocking.
You're all right if you're with somebody, but when you're on your own and you come down here, it's very emotional. And I'm one of them silly old devils that I think a lot of the village. I thought a lot of the people that did get drowned. I went to school with some of them, so it is an emotional place to be.
Serious tidal surges like the one that struck Britain in 1953 are still happening. As recently as 2013, a big one struck the coast of Norfolk. Hemsby, just around the coast from Hunstanton, suffered serious damage to its coastline.
There was a storm surge and there were damaging winds, and most impactful was property along that shoreline, along the east coast of Norfolk, places such as Hemsby, seeing property actually just being rolled into the sea by the action of the wind and the rain and the waves.
Just before Christmas, there were houses here. The winter storms simply washed them away. 20 years ago, these dunes stretched hundreds of yards out in that direction. Now all that remains is a thin sliver standing between the North Sea and much of low-lying Norfolk.
Thanks to more accurate forecasting and stronger sea defences, no lives were lost. But the unstoppable power of North Sea storms and their tidal surges was immediately apparent on the evening news. Despite the encroachment of the sea into the east of England, many communities put up a brave fight against the pitiless advance of the North Sea.
I got in there, got me 2 little kittens out, and a few people I don't even know were just coming here, grabbing what they could, taking it out, forming a human chain down there and storing everything down the pub. It was pretty difficult, it still is, because that was our main residence.
Much of the east coast, of course, is pretty sandy. More and more of that sandstone is going to get washed away. Sadly, this sort of thing could be repeated in years to come.
60 years before, many towns along the coast of Suffolk are hit by the great storm as it continues on its path of devastation.
The storm is then moving around the coast of Britain, around the sort of bulk of East Anglia that sticks out into the North Sea, and it catches as it goes down the port of Felixstowe, which loses about 41 people that night, completely flooded, and also, tragically, a trawler boat.
The conditions on the coast are terrible, but being out at sea can be lethal. In 1953, Glenys Summers lives with her family in Lowestoft.
My grandfather, named George William Turner, was a deckhand. He was a father figure to me. There wasn't a lot of emotional love in our family, but Grandad was love.
Her grandfather, George, works on the fishing trawler Guava, based out of Lowestoft. Her family depends on George's salary and the fish that he brings home from trips out into the North Sea.
He would come home with his sack of fish, his kit bag. He was a lovely man. I mean, he was my hero.
On the morning of the storm, the Guava set sail on a fishing trip to Dogger Bank in the North Sea. right into the path of the heavy weather as it surges south. As the storm arrives, the worried family gather around their shortwave radio.
And I realised then something was wrong. My grandmother had the old wireless tuned into the airband where the skippers would talk. I can remember there being quite an atmosphere when his boat was lost because there's nothing coming over the airwaves.
The Guava is lost with all hands during the storm, plunging Glenys's family into chaos.
There was a lot of upset. I'd never seen them crying like that before. I didn't know where Grandad was.
For Glenys, the loss is hard to accept.
And I made it my task of going up to look for his boat and to wander on the cliff. And every boat that went past, I'd wave at. I'd say, everything's going to be right, Grandad's coming home. And of course it wasn't.
The trawler is never seen again.
And all hands on deck went down with the boat, 11 people, including one 16-year-old boy whose first trip that was. So that hit Lowestoft, which is where the boat had come from, really badly. So Lowestoft and Felixstowe and other places in Suffolk have, still have terrible memories of that night.
As chaos reigns across East Anglia, the storm and its tidal surge push south, down through the North Sea.
This storm, which tracked very quickly across the northern side of Scotland down towards the North Sea, is grinding to a halt. And so we just have a fetch of hundreds of miles of northerly winds, which is pushing that water continually down into a small area. It's funneling down into the channel, which is very shallow. And that's really where the problem lies.
As the water rushes south, the densely populated coastline of southeast England is in its sights.
It's now heading for really the Thames estuary, the coast of Essex, particularly flat reclaimed salt marsh often, very flat low-lying lands. And they are all asleep in their bungalows and houses, and they don't know what's coming.
The early hours of Sunday morning, the storm and surge that have been spreading tragedy across Britain finally arrive at the Thames estuary.
So tragically, two things really are happening. No one is warning these people, the communities along this coastline, of what's happened already during the early evening across Norfolk and the eastern coast of England. And they're sleeping. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is really where the nightmare amplifies, magnifies even further.
1953 is still a time of post-war rationing and austerity. Many families who were bombed out of the East End of London have been relocated to the Essex coast.
It was full of people who were living often in flimsy accommodation, such as bungalows, holiday sort of chalets, often that sort of accommodation, maybe prefabs, and in a really low-lying pit of the coast.
Across Essex, and especially in low-lying Canvey Island, prefab houses are built to provide accommodation to increasing numbers of families from the post-war baby boom.
Actually, a pal of mine lived in a prefab, and I was quite surprised how comfortable it was. It didn't look very much from the outside, but it was nice inside.
This combination of single-storey houses in low-lying areas will spell disaster in the final stages of the Great Storm of 1953. 15-year-old Barry Barton is fast asleep in his family home near Wakering in southeast Essex. It is part of a converted prisoner of war camp made up of Nissen huts in a low-lying farmer's field.
Mother come in bedroom, she said, Barry, she said, there's water in here, in the house. I went into the bathroom thinking there was a leak or something. And when I got into the bathroom, the water was just bubbling all up through the toilet. And I thought, well, that's strange, because that's, you know, that is not just a leak. And when I looked out, the water was actually up to my windowsill, and all I could see was water and the moon right across the water.
Barry's camp is in the grip of the tidal surge. He has seconds before he is cut off in the flood.
You got into the living room, couldn't open the door, so I pushed as hard as I could, and as it gave way to the pressure outside, it just threw me across the room, and I thought, right, that's it, we've got to get out now.
Grabbing his mother, sister, and his sister's baby, the small family head out into the rushing water to escape the flood. Barry's sister gets separated in the panic and confusion.
Luckily, the moon was shining so bright, I could see her, you know. I got to her, and I took the baby off of her, and I said, right, give us your hand, and I'll pull you across this deep bit. But going across through the water, it was eddying round us more than anything, but it was the cold that was the worst bit. It was really, really cold.
With cold, 6-degree water rushing around them, they all risk hypothermia and drowning.
You couldn't feel from your waist down. My mum was 5'2", and she said to me, you go on, don't worry about me. I couldn't do that.
Through luck and determination, they make it through the flood to the nearby church.
I didn't think we was going to make it, but as I say, I didn't panic. I was the man in the house, I had to do it. When we actually got to the village hall, got my mother and my sister in there, and my legs just went.
The exhausted Barry can hear the cries of those still trapped in the camp.
And all that time, you could hear people calling out across from the camp. It's horrible. And you think to yourself, I could have done something. But 15-year-old, I suppose, you couldn't.
As the tidal surge races along the Essex coastline, it overwhelms coastal settlements, killing dozens of people. But the greatest concentration of vulnerable people lives in the densely packed town of Canvey Island.
There is a full moon, but it lights up this rather incredible scene, which is a huge storm surge coming straight for Canvey and topples over the seawall and really inundates the entire island.
David Blackwell lives with his family on the higher ground in the west of the island.
We used to have street parties all the time, and neighbours were always getting them coming in for cups of tea, and yeah, it was great times.
At 2 in the morning, 5-year-old David is woken up by a commotion in the house.
My dad being a part-time fireman, every local fireman had a bell, so when there was a fire, the bell used to ring. And I could hear a lot of running around, but as he went out the front gate, he noticed there was water all coming out the drains, flooding into the road, which quite shocked him. So he ran back and woke my 2 brothers up to tell them to knock the neighbours up opposite in the bungalow, tell them there could be a flood happening.
The lowest point in Canvey is the Newlands area to the northeast of the island. Here, the mud sea defences have given way as the surge strikes from the east. Joan Lithgow and her husband Jeff are woken by their baby daughter Jean in their bungalow.
We heard her screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," and as we've looked, she's fallen into the water. We were floating on the mattress, and as Jeff's jumped off, I've gone up against the wall and he's picked her up, and she was floating right near the fireplace and could have been sucked up the chimney, really, with the water. And then I've grabbed her off of him, and she was right out of it.
At low-lying Canvey, the powerful floodwaters arrive so fast that living in a single-storey house could be deadly.
So a lot of people trying to escape the flood, first they would go onto a table or something like that, but very soon the flood water is rising so high that they have to go further up. But, you know, they're in a prefab, which is single story. There's not many places to go. So they might first go into the roof, if they can get through to the roof. And there's quite a thin asbestos roof on prefab housing.
I was waist deep in water. So then Jeff had put the table in the corner of the room, put a chair on top of it, knocked a hole in the ceiling, and I've got Jean wrapped in the blanket.
Joan, her husband and baby Jean seek shelter in the rafters of their bungalow. For many in the flood zone who live in prefabs, they end up soaking wet on the roof.
And unfortunately, help is a long time coming for a lot of these people. So what happened tragically is that a lot of people were stuck on these roofs all night and into Sunday.
Within seconds, the flood transforms the landscape of Canvey Island. For many, soaking wet and exposed to sub-zero conditions, their fight to stay alive is just beginning. As dawn approaches on the 1st of February 1953, hundreds of miles of British coastline are underwater and thousands are in need of rescue.
The fact that people had to wait for so long sometimes to be saved really is testimony to the violence of the storm. You know, it was extremely difficult to get to people. The power of that flood was incredible.
Conditions are brutal, but many locals begin improvised rescue operations as soon as they can. Near Barry Barton's flooded camp in Wakering, Roger Sampson is woken by a disturbance in his house.
Mother wasn't a particularly good sleeper, and she thought she could hear people screaming.
Roger's father, known as Sammy, is a fisherman. He heads towards the source of the screaming, the converted POW camp where Barry Barton lives.
That's where he started doing a rescue, but he had a very small dinghy, and it only held two other people, so we can only bring 2 people at a time. The further you went into the camp, obviously the deeper the water got, but there was this one particular hut. He heard some cries, managed to reach it, and it was quite deep there.
And the last hut in that row, Mr. Whitehead and his wife and 2 children, they lived there.
He climbed up onto the roof, and there was a little hole, but he made it bigger. What he saw when he looked in, there was a gentleman, arms outstretched, a child in each arm, and unfortunately one of the children had bubbles coming out of his mouth. The guy just had his head above water, arms outstretched, with a child in each arm.
And he went in there and broke open the roof and took the children off of him, and then pulled the father out, Phil Whitehead. Very brave.
Sadly, the young child does not survive.
That one stayed with him for a long while. As the morning wore on, other guys were down there getting more boats, and they all chipped in to help. But I think he was responsible for about 30 himself, out of over 100 people.
As the sun rises, more brave rescues take place in the treacherous flood zone. Joan, her husband and her baby have survived the early hours.
As it started getting light, and then we heard people talking, and it was the police and firemen with this rowing boat.
Joan and her family survive the night because they are protected from the elements inside the loft. But many are not so lucky.
And the one thing my father did tell me, a lot of the people that died were actually climbed to safety on top of their roofs, but of course it was hypothermia what killed them, because they was freezing cold, soaking wet, sitting on the roof of a house in the pitch black, waiting for someone to rescue And that didn't happen for quite a while.
In a race against time, David Blackwell's firefighter father works tirelessly to rescue the stranded.
He never had no sleep for days, so yeah, it was hard times.
But for some, there are happy endings in store.
My younger brother Roger is now married to Jean, who was the little baby they were lucky to rescue, and lucky still to be alive in all that weather and that freezing cold.
The sun rises on the 1st of February 1953, revealing a devastated waterland along the east coast of Britain.
A frigate was flung over onto her side, and in an adjacent berth, a submarine was sunk. Foulness Island was so badly flooded that it was at first reported to have disappeared.
Shocking scenes from the flood zone appear on the newly arrived television sets across Britain.
After the floods, the struggle to fill the breaches. Hard and continuous work it is, too.
It's on the television, it's in the cinema. It was a force of nature which was like, we'd never seen it like that. It just showed how vulnerable we were.
On the ground, communities across Britain deal with the shock of lives lost. 31 lost at Hunstanton, 25 at Snettisham, 41 at Felixstowe, 59 at Canvey Island. In total, 307 lives lost on land and 224 at sea. Over 130 of those on the Princess Victoria.
They all lived in close proximity to each other and knew each other. The emotional price for everybody, for the families of people that were lost in that boat, must have been huge.
We tend to recall it here because it was our community which was affected, as well as over in Larne. But we've got to remember that, you know, this affected much of Great Britain.
There's 25 people got drowned down Snettisham Beach. For a small village like ours, to lose 25 people was a lot of people, and they knew everyone.
A mere 50 miles away on the other side of the North Sea from East Anglia and Essex, loss of life is even more severe.
Whilst this was going on across the eastern side of the UK, across in the Netherlands, people were losing their lives.
Many villages were swept away by a massive wall of water that overwhelmed the legendary dike system that has protected Holland for centuries.
The Netherlands was particularly badly hit. Over 1,800 people died there. Something that's remembered in Holland, very much so to this day.
In North Norfolk, the royal family have been weathering the storm at Sandringham. It's the first national emergency for Elizabeth as a young queen. In one of her last public engagements in Norfolk in 2022, the Queen talked about witnessing the 1953 disaster.
And the Queen very, very clearly remembered the 53 floods. A day later, she decided to visit Hunstanton with the Duke of Edinburgh to see the devastation for herself. And she recalled to us, she said she see the devastation, it was just like being in the war again. But she was so inspired by the community spirit of the people around, trying to start rebuilding and clearing as much of the debris as quickly as could to start rebuilding their lives again.
The storm of 1953 is one of the worst natural disasters to strike Britain in the modern era. Estimated in today's money at nearly £1.2 billion of damage, alongside 24,000 homes lost. As the scale of the disaster is revealed, the question is, could this happen again?
"24 hours a day, the little ships plough to and fro from the mainland to Canvey Island to help in mending the breached walls."
In the aftermath of the floods, Winston Churchill's government is under pressure to explain why the tragedy of 1953 took place.
Britain realised that this is an appalling thing to have happened. It's the worst natural disaster that we've had for hundreds of years, and something really needs to be done about it, and particularly about flood risks.
The government commissions an inquiry. Published the following year, it sounds surprisingly modern.
What is so interesting, though, about the Waverley Report is that it's the first time that climate change is really mentioned as a factor in something like a storm surge. Sea levels are rising because of glaciers melting, because of temperatures rising, because of global warming. Although it's not connected in 1954, which is when the Waverley Report came out, to human actions, nonetheless, this is a quite important moment for understanding that the climate itself is changing and causing really adverse effects on a country like ours.
The majority of deaths are found to be due to inadequate or non-existent sea defences.
The loss of life during 1953 and the impacts across a huge swathe of the country was a real wake-up call to policymakers, to engineers, to those people who are looking after the coastal defences along the coastline of the UK.
A few miles from this devastation that was Canvey Island lives a man who believes he has the answer. He's 71-year-old William Croxford of Westcliff-on-Sea. The remedy, he claims, lies in building a new type of bungalow that rises with the level of the water, just like a lift. See how it floats on the tank. His idea may help both him and others who live near the unpredictable sea.
Floating bungalows don't catch on. The solution to the immediate problem is a massive upgrade of seawalls along the vulnerable eastern coast of England. But certain sections of the eastern coastline, like Hemsby and Norfolk, are still fighting a losing battle against storms and surges.
It is a huge issue for the future. Do we let the sea have the advantage, or do we protect ourselves against it? And how much protection do we give our country?
One part of the country that narrowly escaped the worst of the surge is London. But water still rose to the top of the Victoria and Chelsea embankments. A major London flood was narrowly avoided.
London sits on an estuary, on a floodplain, and there are millions of people living there, doing business there, travelling in and out. So it's a region which needs to be protected.
The answer is the Thames Barrier, and it's been protecting Londoners since 1982.
After the Waverley inquiry, the planning into the Thames Barrier took off, and it became an international icon. It protects such a huge area of London and the boroughs of London. It is very impressive indeed.
But whether the defences triggered by 1953 will keep protecting us into a future of rising sea levels is an urgent question.
An event like the 53 storm, obviously it was the catalyst to start discussions about having a Thames barrier. It's been used over 200 times, and it'll be used another 200 times, but it does need upgrading, I dare say. It's served its useful purpose at the moment, but it will need to be improved.
Despite being one of the worst natural disasters Britain has seen for hundreds of years, the Great Storm of 1953 has faded in the national consciousness.
I think it's ironic that so few people remember this storm in 1953. And I work in two schools, and when I asked the children in the schools who had heard of the Princess Victoria, there was only one child out of the two school communities that actually had heard about this disaster.
Father said to me, there'll be another one in 70 years' time. We had a big tide this weekend, very big tide, and the sea was up to the top of the promenade. So it's up there at the moment. I thought, oh no.
For those who live by the sea, the storm of 1953 was a warning from nature that should not be ignored.
The Environment Agency, they're just starting what they call the revampment works on Canvey seawall. That starts today. It's a 3-year project. It's costing £35 million, strengthening the sea defences, It will never go out of people's minds. It'll always be there. And I think it should be that people should remember what we went through in them times and should be really pleased that, you know, hopefully, God forbid, it will never happen again.
For many, the trauma of the power of that storm lives on.
The floods were so horrific. I'll tell you the truth. I can go down on that beach and I walked along that front and sit down and cried. I'm 89. I'm like a kid walking along that beach crying. It's so unreal, if you like.
Worst experience of my life, I think. You know, you had to live through it and that was it, you know, you had to get on with it.
It was just a nightmare of a day. The whole town, community, came together on that night. And we were very proud of that, really proud.